The Victorian mansion overlooking the Columbia River had been watching Cascade Locks for 123 years, its gabled windows like hooded eyes surveying the small Oregon town nestled between towering evergreens and rushing waters. On this particular October evening, shadows pooled in the wraparound porch corners while autumn wind rattled the ornate shutters with an almost deliberate rhythm, carrying the scent of Douglas fir and river mist. Inside the third-floor study, dust motes danced in the amber light of a banker's lamp as aged fingers traced the edges of a leather-bound journal. The entries within spoke of timber rights, land deeds, and family secrets buried deeper than the old-growth roots beneath the volcanic soil. But it was the final entry, dated just 3 days prior, that would have sent tremors through the Columbia Gorge Historical Society had they known of its existence. The truth has a way of surfacing, like salmon returning upstream. What they took from the Chinook families, what they buried in courthouse fires and midnight meetings, what they've hidden behind their charity auctions and church bazaars, it all comes back. The girl they call just the Maid will be the one to set it right. She doesn't know it yet, but she carries the bloodline they tried to erase. The house knows. The house remembers. A gust of wind sent cedar branches scraping against the mansion's slate roof, and somewhere in the walls, old timber creaked as if the house itself were sighing. The journal's pages fluttered closed, and in the growing darkness, the sound of footsteps echoed through empty halls, though the house had been officially vacant for months. By morning, the mansion would have a new owner. By evening, the town of Cascade Locks would never be the same. The old house had seen it all. The celebrations when the timber contracts were signed, the secret meetings when inconvenient families needed to be relocated, the careful destruction of documents that might one day prove embarrassing. It had watched 3 generations of the same family profit from theft while maintaining the facade of respectability. But houses, like rivers, have long memories. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, they release what they've been holding back. In the pre-dawn darkness, a loose floorboard in the mansion's library creaked once, twice, then settled into place. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden for nearly a century, lay documents that would soon see the light of day. The house was preparing to tell its secrets at last. River Clearwater stood in the morning light filtering through the mansion's kitchen windows, her reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces of copper pots she'd spent 3 years keeping pristine. At 29, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from years of making herself invisible while others lived their lives in bold strokes around her. Her dark hair, always pulled back in a practical bun, caught glints of auburn that she'd inherited from a grandmother she'd never known, and her hands, calloused from honest work, moved with the efficiency of someone who understood that survival meant staying indispensable. The foreclosure notice in her apartment mailbox had been the final blow in a series of devastating weeks. First, her mother's medical bills had consumed her savings, diabetes complications that had required multiple hospitalizations and expensive treatments that insurance refused to cover. Then her second job at the Thunder Island Brewing Company had been eliminated due to seasonal adjustments, a euphemism that meant the owner's son needed employment more than she did. Now, even her modest studio apartment near the old locks was slipping away, the rent having increased beyond her means when new ownership decided to upgrade the building. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days maintaining a mansion worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime, while unable to afford her own rent. Every morning, she cleaned rooms larger than her entire living space, polished silver that could pay her bills for months, and tended gardens that cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford emerged from the dining room with the imperious bearing of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world's hierarchy. At 64, she maintained the preserved elegance of the Columbia Gorge's upper crust, silver hair sculpted into submission by weekly appointments at the Hood River Salon, designer clothing that whispered rather than shouted wealth, and the particular posture that came from generations of assuming others would accommodate her needs. The Ashford family had been pillars of Cascade Lock society since the timber boom of the 1920s, their name gracing the library wing, the hospital auxiliary, and half the scholarships at the local school. "River, dear Mrs. Ashford's voice carried the honeyed condescension that had characterized their relationship for 3 years. "I've been thinking about your situation. You know how fond I am of you. River's hands stilled on the breakfast dishes she was clearing. In her experience, Mrs. Ashford's fondness always came with conditions. The older woman had a way of presenting her generosity as though it were a natural law rather than a choice, making recipients feel both grateful and somehow diminished by their need. "The house is really too much for me to maintain," Mrs. Ashford continued, settling into her favorite armchair with practiced grace. The chair faced the massive windows that overlooked the Columbia River, a view that had been carefully curated by removing several large trees that had cluttered the sightline. "And you've been so devoted, so reliable. I've decided to make you an offer." The older woman's smile held the satisfaction of someone about to demonstrate their magnanimity. She gestured toward the legal documents spread across the mahogany side table, papers that River now noticed had been prepared with deliberate care, each page marked with colored tabs and sticky notes. "I'm prepared to sign the house over to you, River. Free and clear. All I ask in return is that you continue to care for it, and for me, for the remainder of my life. Think of it as a sort of delayed inheritance." River felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The Ashford mansion, worth easily $3 million in the current Columbia Gorge market, being offered to her? She stared at the papers, their legal language swimming before her eyes, while her mind raced through the implications. She would have security, a home, a future. The medical bills would be manageable. She could finally breathe without calculating whether she could afford her next meal. The desperation of her situation made the offer seem like divine intervention. 3 nights earlier, she'd sat in her car outside the grocery store, counting and recounting the few bills in her wallet, trying to determine whether she could afford both food and gas. The humiliation of that moment, a college-educated woman reduced to choosing between necessities, had crystallized her understanding of how precarious her existence had become. "I don't understand," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Mrs. Ashford's expression softened in a way that seemed almost maternal. The River had learned to be wary of the woman's emotional displays. They often preceded requests for additional unpaid work or subtle criticisms disguised as concern. "You remind me of myself at your age, dear. Alone in the world, struggling to make ends meet. Consider it my way of ensuring the house stays in caring hands." The story Mrs. Ashford told was compelling in its simplicity. She had been orphaned young, taken in by distant relatives who'd treated her more like an employee than family. She'd worked her way through secretarial school, married above her station, and now found herself alone in a house too large for one person. River's dedication, her attention to detail, her quiet presence, all of it had convinced Mrs. Ashford that she was the right person to inherit not just the property, but the responsibility that came with it. "Of course, there are some conditions," Mrs. Ashford continued, her tone remaining light even as her words grew more specific. "You would need to maintain the house in its current condition. The gardens must be tended, the historical society tours must continue, and you would provide me with a comfortable apartment in the East Wing. Nothing too demanding, dear. Just the security of knowing I can remain in my family home." That afternoon, River signed the papers with a trembling hand. Mrs. Ashford's lawyer, a distinguished man named Hudson Stevenson whose family had represented the Ashfords for generations, serving as witness. The older woman insisted on celebrating with champagne from the Willamette Valley. The River barely tasted it. The whole transaction felt surreal, like a fairy tale where she'd been transformed from servant to property owner with the stroke of a pen. But as River lay in her new bed that first night, the master bedroom had been graciously offered to her. Though Mrs. Ashford retained her suite in the East Wing, she found herself unable to sleep. The house made sounds she'd never noticed during her working hours, settling timbers, whined through window frames, and something that almost sounded like whispers in the walls. Outside, the Columbia River rushed past with its eternal purpose, carrying the secrets of the mountains to the sea. Fairy tales, River would soon learn, often had darker origins than the sanitized version suggested. The whispers started immediately. Cascade Lock's social network operated with the efficiency of a telegraph system, and news of the unprecedented transaction spread through the Cascade Lock's coffee company, Brigham Fish Market, and the Methodist Church Committee within hours. The consensus was unanimous. Something wasn't right about Eleanor Ashford signing over the family mansion to just the maid. River first noticed the stares during her shopping trip to the local IGA. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when she passed, and she caught fragments of speculation that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Gold digger," whispered Mrs. Patterson from the pharmacy. "Must have something on the old woman," muttered Bob Freeman from the hardware store. The assumptions were brutal in their clarity. No one believed she could have earned such generosity through honest work. At the community bank, where she'd gone to establish her new financial reality, the teller's eyes widened when she saw the deed paperwork. River had known Jennifer Mills since high school, and the woman's reaction cut deeper than the stranger's whispers. "Congratulations, Miss Clearwater," Jennifer said, but her tone suggested the opposite sentiment. "That's quite a generous arrangement. I'm sure you'll be very comfortable." The emphasis on comfortable carried implications that made River's skin crawl. She'd grown up in this town, attended the same schools as these people, yet they were treating her like an opportunist who'd somehow manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman. The irony was that River felt more manipulated than manipulative. The house came with obligations that grew heavier each day, and Mrs. Ashford's needs seemed to expand to fill every available moment. It was Dr. Oliver Riverhawk who first approached her with something other than judgment. She encountered him at the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center, where she'd gone seeking information about the mansion's history. Mrs. Ashford had mentioned that the Historical Society occasionally gave tours, and River wanted to understand what she'd inherited beyond just bricks and mortar. At 57, Dr. Riverhawk carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades teaching Pacific Northwest history at Portland State University. His weathered face spoke of Chinook ancestry, and his eyes held the particular intensity of someone who'd spent years fighting to preserve stories others preferred forgotten. His graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and he wore the kind of practical clothing that suggested comfort in both academic halls and hiking trails. "You're the young woman who inherited the Ashford place," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. His voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. River nodded, unsure how to respond to this unexpected approach. After days of hostile stares and whispered accusations, neutral observation felt like kindness. "I knew your great-grandmother," Dr. Riverhawk continued, studying her face with scholarly interest. "Mary Salmon Runner. You have her eyes." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, but I think you're mistaken. My great-grandmother was Margaret Clearwater. She died before I was born." Dr. Riverhawk's expression grew thoughtful, and he glanced around the museum's main gallery before speaking again. "Perhaps we should sit down. There are things about your family history that might surprise you." They settled in the museum's cramped research room, surrounded by boxes of documents and faded photographs that chronicled the Columbia Gorge's complex history. Dr. Riverhawk pulled out a manila folder he seemed to have been carrying for this exact purpose, as though he'd been waiting for this conversation for years. "Your grandmother was Sarah Salmon Runner," he began, opening the folder to reveal a photograph of a young Chinook woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to River's own. The woman in the photo had the same high cheekbones, the same intelligent eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw. She married your grandfather in 1954, but the marriage was complicated by the political climate of the time. River stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. The woman looked so familiar that River felt she should remember her, though that was impossible. "I don't understand. My mother never mentioned any of this." "Your mother was very young when Sarah died," Dr. Riverhawk explained gently. "Car accident on Highway 14, just across the river. Sarah was driving back from a meeting in Stevenson, something about land rights, according to the police report. But the circumstances—" He shook his head. "Let's just say that Sarah's family had been asking uncomfortable questions about old land deals. The implication hung in the air between them." Dr. Riverhawk pulled out another document, a deed dated 1925, bearing the signature of Chief Joseph Salmon Runner in careful script. The paper was yellowed with age but still legible, its official seals and witness signatures proclaiming its authenticity. "Your great-great-grandfather owned the land where the Ashford Mansion now stands," Dr. Riverhawk continued. 400 acres of prime, timber-producing territory along the Columbia River. The family had lived there for generations, long before Oregon became a state. They lost it in what were called legal proceedings, but which were really systematic dispossession. The implications began to crystallize in River's mind like ice forming on a winter pond. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that Eleanor Ashford's family built their fortune on land that was stolen from your ancestors," Dr. Riverhawk said quietly. "And I suspect Mrs. Ashford knows exactly who you are." That evening, River found herself alone in the mansion's vast library, surrounded by books that chronicled the Ashford family's rise to prominence. The official histories painted a picture of enterprising immigrants who'd built their success through hard work and shrewd timber dealings. Eleanor's great-grandfather, William Ashford, was portrayed as a visionary who'd recognized the Columbia Gorge's potential before others, purchasing undeveloped land at favorable prices and building the lumber mill that had employed half the town for decades. But now, knowing what to look for, River began to notice gaps in the narrative. The year 1925 was conspicuously absent from the family chronicles. The library's collection of local newspapers from that era was missing several key months. And in the margin of one historical account, she found a handwritten note in faded ink. The Chinook families. What became of their children? As she delved deeper into the mansion's hidden corners, River discovered that the house itself held secrets. The building was a maze of unexpected spaces, servant stairs that led to forgotten closets, dumbwaiters that connected floors in puzzling ways, and rooms that seemed to exist outside the mansion's logical layout. It was behind a false panel in the library wall, discovered when she noticed that the bookshelf didn't quite align with the room's proportions, that she found the collection of documents that the official histories had omitted. The hidden compartment contained a treasure trove of primary sources, legal challenges filed by Chinook families, correspondence between local officials and timber companies, maps showing the original tribal territories, and photographs of families who'd been relocated to make way for progress. But it was the letter dated 1925 from Eleanor Ashford's grandfather to a business associate that stopped River's breath. The Chinook matter has been resolved more smoothly than anticipated. The Salmon Runner property is now ours, and the family has been relocated to the reservation. Chief Joseph proved surprisingly cooperative once we explained the alternatives. The timber rights alone will secure our fortune for generations. It's unfortunate that such measures were necessary, but business is business. The old ways must yield to progress, and sometimes that progress requires firm guidance. River's hands shook as she read the letter. The casual cruelty of the language, the reduction of her ancestors to a matter to be resolved, struck her with visceral force. But it was the final paragraph that made her blood run cold. Should any of their descendants ever return to claim what they believe is theirs, we must be prepared. The Chinook have long memories, and blood calls to blood. We have taken precautions to ensure that the true history remains buried, but vigilance will be required. I have instructed Morrison and Stevenson to maintain careful records of all tribal descendants in the area. Knowledge is the best defense against future complications. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. She quickly concealed the documents and emerged from the library to find Mrs. Ashford descending the main staircase, her face carrying an expression of satisfied completion. In the lamplight, the older woman's features seemed sharper, more predatory than River had noticed before. "Still up, dear?" Mrs. Ashford asked, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. "I was just checking on some family documents upstairs, making sure everything is in order." As she watched the older woman retreat to her room, River realized that the house transfer hadn't been an act of generosity. It had been a trap, carefully planned and expertly executed. But the question that kept her awake for the rest of the night was more troubling. What did Eleanor Ashford really want? The first threatening phone call came at 3 in the morning. River jolted awake to the shrill ring of the mansion's antique telephone, her heart racing as she fumbled for the receiver in the darkness. The voice that greeted her was electronically distorted but unmistakably menacing. "You need to stop digging," the caller said. "Some things are better left buried. Accidents happen to people who don't know when to mind their own business." The line went dead, leaving River alone with the echo of the threat and the growing realization that her discovery in the library hadn't gone unnoticed. She spent the remainder of the night checking locks and windows, her newfound security in the mansion feeling suddenly illusory. The house that had seemed like salvation now felt like a prison, its many windows and multiple entrances offering too many opportunities for unwanted visitors. The next morning brought a visit from Hudson Stevenson, Cascade Lock's most prominent attorney and a man whose family had served the Ashford interests for 3 generations. He arrived with the polished bearing of someone accustomed to making problems disappear through legal maneuvering, his silver Mercedes announcing his importance before he'd even stepped out of the vehicle. "Miss Clearwater," he said, settling into the mansion's formal parlor without invitation. "I represent certain parties who are concerned about your recent activities." Stevenson was the kind of man who projected authority through expensive suits and calculated gestures. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. River had met him during the house transfer, but this visit felt different, more predatory than professional. River maintained her composure despite the surge of adrenaline. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Stevenson," His smile was practiced and utterly cold. I think you do. You've been asking questions about matters that were settled decades ago. Matters that certain families would prefer remain private. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Historical research can be fascinating, but it can also be dangerous when it ventures into areas better left alone. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you guidance, Stevenson replied smoothly. You've inherited a wonderful property, Miss Clearwater. You should focus on enjoying it rather than pursuing research that might prove uncomfortable for everyone involved. He leaned forward slightly. The Ashford family has been generous to you. It would be unfortunate if that generosity were to be reconsidered. After he left, River realized that her investigation had attracted attention from forces far more powerful than she'd imagined. The Ashford family's influence extended throughout the Columbia Gorge's power structure, and her questions were being perceived as a threat to more than just historical reputation. She began to understand that she'd stumbled into a conspiracy that had been actively maintained for nearly a century. She found an unexpected ally in Hazel Windriver, a woman her own age who worked as a paralegal at the legal aid clinic in Hood River. Hazel's Chinook heritage had made her deeply invested in uncovering the truth about the systematic dispossession of native lands in the Pacific Northwest. When River approached her with the hidden documents, Hazel's reaction was immediate and intense. I've been looking for evidence like this for years, Hazel said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. They were sitting in the legal aid clinic's conference room, surrounded by case files and law books that documented generations of legal battles. My great-grandfather lost his land in similar circumstances. The same legal firms, the same tactics, the same results. Hazel was everything River wasn't. Outspoken where River was cautious, confrontational where River sought harmony. Her long black hair was often adorned with traditional beadwork, and she wore her heritage proudly in a way that sometimes made others uncomfortable. She'd grown up on the reservation but had fought her way through law school, determined to use the legal system that had oppressed her people to finally achieve justice. Together, they began to piece together a pattern of deliberate theft that extended far beyond the Salmon Runner property. The documents River had found were part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple Chinook families, corrupt officials, and business interests that had systematically acquired native lands through legal manipulation and outright fraud. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous their situation became. River's car tires were slashed while she grocery shopped, the cuts too clean to be accidental. Hazel received a visit from building inspectors who found numerous violations in her apartment that had never existed before. Both women noticed the same vehicles following them at different times, a black SUV with tinted windows that seemed to appear whenever they left their homes. The surveillance became increasingly obvious and intimidating. River's mail was clearly being tampered with, arriving days late or not at all. Her internet history was somehow being monitored, as evidenced by targeted advertisements for legal services and debt relief that appeared after her online research sessions. Even her phone seemed compromised. Conversations with Hazel were interrupted by strange clicking sounds and brief disconnections. It was during a late-night research session in the mansion's library that they uncovered the document that changed everything. Hidden behind a false back in an antique desk drawer, they found a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be the original deed to the Salmon Runner property, not the forged version that had been used to justify the seizure, but the legitimate document bearing the proper seals and signatures of the territorial government. More importantly, they found a letter dated just 6 months earlier, written in Eleanor Ashford's distinctive handwriting. The paper was expensive, bearing the Ashford family crest, and the ink was from the Mont Blanc pen River had seen the older woman use for important correspondence. The girl is exactly as we hoped, desperate, grateful, and completely unaware of her heritage. The house transfer serves our purposes perfectly. Should she ever discover the truth, she will be so compromised by her acceptance of the property that she cannot pursue legal action without implicating herself in the cover-up. We have turned her into an unwitting accomplice in the concealment of our family's crimes. The irony is delicious. The descendant of the original owners now serves as the guardian of our theft. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as HS, but the implications were clear. Eleanor Ashford had researched River's ancestry, identified her as a descendant of the original landowners, and deliberately orchestrated the house transfer as a means of preventing her from pursuing justice. She's been playing a game that's decades in the making, Hazel whispered, her face pale in the lamplight. You weren't chosen because you were a good employee, River. You were chosen because you were a threat that needed to be neutralized. The revelation that followed was even more devastating. Among the documents, they found evidence that Eleanor Ashford had been systematically tracking the descendants of all the Chinook families who'd lost their land. Some had been bought off with small payments and non-disclosure agreements. Others had been intimidated into silence through various means, job losses, legal troubles, or simple fear. But it was the final document that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. A balance sheet showing the current value of the timber rights on the various properties, rights that legally belonged to the Chinook descendants, totaled over $60 million. The money was being held in a complex trust structure designed to prevent the rightful owners from ever gaining access to it. The trust documents revealed a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legal maneuvers that had successfully hidden the stolen wealth for generations. The Ashford family wasn't just living off the proceeds of theft, they had built an entire financial empire on the foundation of stolen land, using modern legal techniques to launder historical crimes. "We need to go public with this," Hazel said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Though I don't know who we can trust." That night, River lay awake in the mansion's master bedroom, a room she'd never felt entitled to occupy despite now owning the house, and contemplated the impossible situation she'd found herself in. Eleanor Ashford had been right about one thing. Accepting the house had made her complicit in the cover-up. Any attempt to expose the truth would require her to explain how she'd come to possess the evidence, potentially invalidating her own claim to the property and leaving her with nothing. But as she stared at the ornate ceiling and listened to the house's nocturnal sounds, River realized that her ancestors' voices were growing stronger. The Chinook families who'd lost everything deserved justice, even if it meant sacrificing her own security. The question was whether she would have the chance to provide it, or whether the forces arrayed against her would silence her before she could act. Outside her window, the Columbia River continued its eternal journey to the sea, carrying with it the memories of all who'd lived along its banks. River fell asleep to the sound of water over stones, dreaming of salmon swimming upstream against impossible odds, driven by instincts older than human law. The confrontation came sooner than expected. River woke to find Eleanor Ashford standing in the bedroom doorway, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of frail elderly woman. Her posture was straight, her eyes sharp with calculation, and her smile held all the warmth of winter frost. In the pre-dawn darkness, she looked less like a benevolent benefactor than a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. "I know what you've found," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice carrying a new authority. Gone was the honeyed condescension of their previous interactions, replaced by the steel of someone accustomed to wielding power without pretense. "And I know what you're planning to do with it." River sat up, her mind racing through escape routes and defense strategies. The mansion that had once felt like sanctuary now seemed like a trap, its isolated location and maze-like interior working against her. "Then you know that the truth is going to come out. Is it?" Mrs. Ashford moved into the room with predatory grace, her silk robe rustling with each calculated step. "You signed legal documents accepting this house, Miss Clearwater. You've been living here for weeks, enjoying the benefits of property that you now claim was stolen. How do you think that will look to a jury?" The older woman's laugh was genuinely amused, the sound of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. "You think I didn't plan for this possibility? I've had lawyers gaming out every scenario for months. The moment you accepted this house, you became legally complicit in the concealment of the original theft. Try to expose us, and you'll be prosecuted as an accessory after the fact." Mrs. Ashford began pacing the room, her movements betraying the energy and calculation of someone far younger than her years. "Do you really think it was coincidence that brought you to work for me? I've been tracking salmon runner descendants for decades, waiting for the right opportunity. You were perfect, educated enough to be credible, desperate enough to be grateful, and naive enough to be manipulated." The revelation hit River like a physical blow. "You've been watching me." "Watching, researching, planning," Mrs. Ashford confirmed. "Your mother's medical bills weren't accidents of fate, dear. Do you think it was chance that her insurance claims were repeatedly denied? That her treatments were delayed by bureaucratic complications? We needed you desperate, and desperation was easily arranged." The cruelty of it staggered River. Her mother's suffering, the nights spent in hospital waiting rooms, the humiliation of begging insurance companies for coverage, all of it had been orchestrated to force River into accepting the house transfer. But River had spent the sleepless hours before dawn preparing for this moment. Her hand moved slowly toward the nightstand, where her phone lay apparently innocent. "You made one mistake, Mrs. Ashford. You assumed I was as selfish as you are." She pulled out her phone and showed the older woman the screen, a video recording that had been streaming live to Hazel Windriver for the past 15 minutes. This entire conversation has been broadcast to the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs legal team, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and 3 different news organizations. Mrs. Ashford's composure cracked for the first time, her face contorting with rage. "You foolish girl. You have no idea what you've done." "I've done what my ancestors couldn't," River replied, standing to face her adversary. "I've exposed the truth." The sound of vehicles arriving in the mansion's circular driveway interrupted their confrontation. Through the bedroom windows, River could see federal agents and local police coordinating what appeared to be a comprehensive operation. Hazel's voice came through the phone speaker, filled with triumph and relief. "The Confederated Tribes Attorney General has filed federal charges," Hazel reported. "The FBI is executing search warrants on 6 different properties. And the news teams are setting up for what they're calling the biggest story to hit the Columbia Gorge since the Bonneville Dam scandal." Mrs. Ashford's defeat was complete, but her venom remained potent. "You think you've won something? You've destroyed yourself for people who died a century ago. The house will be tied up in legal proceedings for years. You'll have nothing." "I'll have something you never understood," River replied. "I'll have the truth." The aftermath unfolded with the inexorable force of justice delayed but not denied. The documents River had discovered led to a federal investigation that uncovered a century-long pattern of systematic theft. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. It reached into banks, law firms, government offices, and corporate boardrooms throughout the Pacific Northwest. The Confederated Tribes legal team, armed with evidence of the original fraud, filed suit to recover not just the land but the accumulated value of the timber rights that had been stolen from their ancestors. The case quickly became a landmark in federal courts, establishing precedents for native land rights claims that had been thought impossible to pursue. Eleanor Ashford and her co-conspirators faced federal charges for racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The complex trust structure that had hidden the timber money was dismantled, revealing a network of financial instruments that had successfully laundered the proceeds of historical theft for nearly a century. But the most significant revelation came when federal investigators discovered that the conspiracy had involved not just the Ashford family but a network of lawyers, officials, and business interests that had systematically targeted Chinook property throughout the region. The scope of the theft was staggering: hundreds of families affected, millions of dollars in stolen wealth, and generations of people who'd been denied their rightful inheritance. Hudson Stevenson, faced with evidence of his family's 3-generation involvement in the conspiracy, cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the full extent of the legal manipulation that had been used to steal Chinook lands, including forged documents, bribed officials, and intimidation campaigns that had silenced potential witnesses. The investigation expanded to include similar thefts throughout Oregon and Washington, revealing a pattern of dispossession that had been actively concealed by legal and financial institutions for generations. Banks that had financed the land acquisitions, law firms that had processed the fraudulent transfers, and government officials who had facilitated the thefts all found themselves facing federal scrutiny. The house itself became a symbol of the broader injustice. River formally renounced her claim to the property, despite legal advice that she could have retained ownership. Instead, she requested that the mansion be converted into a museum and research center dedicated to preserving the history of Chinook dispossession in the Pacific Northwest. The transformation wasn't easy. Legal battles over the property's ownership continued for months, with various Ashford relatives attempting to challenge River's renunciation and the government's seizure of the assets. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion had shifted decisively in favor of the tribal claims. River found herself at the center of a media storm, her story becoming a symbol of historical justice finally achieved. She testified before Congress about systematic native land theft, spoke at universities about the ongoing impact of historical injustices, and worked with legal scholars to develop new frameworks for addressing similar cases. The financial settlements were substantial but secondary to the symbolic victory. For the first time in nearly a century, the federal government had acknowledged and remedied a systematic pattern of native land theft. The precedent established by the Ashford case opened doors for similar claims throughout the country. 5 years later, River Clearwater stood in the mansion's renovated library, now serving as the director of the Columbia River Tribal Heritage Center. The room that had once hidden the evidence of systematic theft now displayed that evidence for all to see, part of a comprehensive exhibition that told the story of her ancestors and the families who'd shared their fate. The timber money had been distributed among the descendants of the affected families, providing resources for education, healthcare, and cultural preservation. River had used her portion to complete her education in Pacific Northwest history and tribal law, transforming herself from a reluctant inheritor into a passionate advocate for her people's rights. The mansion's transformation was complete, but the house retained its memory. Visitors often commented on the building's atmosphere, a sense of stories being told, of voices finally being heard. River had come to understand that the house itself had been waiting for this moment, accumulating evidence and preserving truth until someone with the courage to act could set things right. The museum hosted school groups, university researchers, and curious tourists who came to learn about the hidden history of the Columbia Gorge. The exhibitions didn't shy away from the brutality of what had happened, presenting the theft of native lands as part of a broader pattern of systematic oppression that continued to shape contemporary society. Eleanor Ashford had died in federal prison, unrepentant to the end. But her death had brought an unexpected revelation, a deathbed confession revealing the location of additional documents that led to the recovery of even more stolen Chinook property. It seemed that even in death, the truth had a way of asserting itself. Her final words, according to the prison chaplain, were a warning that the old families would never allow the truth to stand. But by then, the truth had already taken root too deeply to be uprooted. Hazel Windriver had become the Confederated Tribe's chief legal advocate for land rights, using the precedent established by the Ashford case to pursue justice for other affected families. The two women had remained close friends, bound by their shared experience of uncovering truth that others had tried to bury. Their friendship had weathered the media attention, the legal complexities, and the ongoing threats from those who still believe the old injustices should remain hidden. The success of their case had inspired similar efforts throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Native communities across the country were using the legal precedents established in Oregon to challenge historical land thefts, and many were succeeding. The Ashford case had become a template for justice that transcended its specific circumstances. On quiet evenings, when the museum was closed and the mansion settled into darkness, River would sometimes walk the halls and listen to the house's sounds. The building no longer carried the weight of secrets, its burden had been lifted, its purpose fulfilled. The shadows that had once concealed injustice now provided peaceful rest for the spirits of those who'd finally found their voice. The Chinook families who'd lost everything in the 1920s had been vindicated, their descendants restored to their rightful place in the story of the Pacific Northwest's development. The timber money that had been stolen was funding scholarships, cultural programs, and legal advocacy that would protect future generations from similar injustices. Children who had grown up believing their heritage was shameful were learning to take pride in their ancestry. But perhaps most importantly, the story itself was now part of the historical record. School children learned about the systematic dispossession of native lands alongside the more comfortable narratives of westward expansion and economic development. The truth, once hidden, had become a permanent part of the community's understanding of its own history. The mansion's gardens, once maintained as a symbol of stolen prosperity, had been replanted with native species that the Chinook had cultivated for centuries. Visitors could walk among camas and huckleberries, learning about sustainable practices that had sustained communities for thousands of years before European arrival. The garden served as both memorial and education, showing what had been lost and what could be recovered. River's personal transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The woman who had once made herself invisible while cleaning other people's homes had become a powerful voice for justice, speaking at conferences and universities about the ongoing impact of historical crimes. She had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in serving others' needs but in honoring her ancestors' memory. The legal implications of the case continued to reverberate through the courts. Other families whose land had been stolen were finding the courage to come forward, armed with the knowledge that justice was possible even for crimes committed decades earlier. The statute of limitations, it turned out, didn't apply to federal crimes involving systematic deprivation of civil rights, a legal principle that opened new avenues for historical redress. As River locked the museum's doors on this particular evening, she paused to read the plaque that had been installed beside the entrance. The words were carved in both English and Chinook, honoring the languages that had shaped this place. In memory of Chief Joseph Salmon Runner and all the Chinook families who lost their land to systematic theft, may their stories never again be buried. May their children never forget who they are. The autumn wind rustled through the Douglas fir trees that surrounded the mansion, and for a moment, River could have sworn she heard the sound of voices carried on the breeze, not the voices of the dead, but of the living, finally free to speak their truth. She had been called just the maid by those who sought to diminish her, but she had proven herself to be something far more powerful, the keeper of memory, the seeker of truth, and the bridge between a painful past and a more just future. The Columbia River continued its eternal journey past the mansion, carrying the stories of all who had lived along its banks. The salmon still returned each year, following ancient patterns that no human law could break. And in the mansion that had once been a monument to theft, children learned about justice, courage, and the power of speaking truth to those who would prefer silence. The house that had once been a monument to theft had become a testament to justice. And in the end, that transformation was worth more than any mansion could ever be. River pulled her jacket closer against the evening chill and began the walk to her modest apartment in town, a space she'd chosen over the luxury of remaining in the mansion, finding peace in simplicity rather than grandeur. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories to tell, and new battles to fight. But tonight, as the lights of Cascade Locks twinkled below, and the river whispered its ancient songs, River Clearwater knew that she had fulfilled a promise made by her ancestors' blood. The truth would not be buried forever. The watching house settled into peaceful sleep, its long vigil finally ended,